A solitary figure stood silhouetted against the window, overlooking the quiet expanse of St. Peter's Square, uttering a single sentence that changed everything. Almost no one in the crowd below understood his words, and not a single journalist caught their true weight. Yet before the sun set, an isolated Christian village remained standing, though nobody knew why. It was a Friday night, just 2 minutes before midnight in Rome, and the Apostolic Palace was draped in shadow. Only 3 windows still glowed, and one belonged to Pope Leo XIV. He had not slept for 3 nights. Clad in his white cassock, the pontiff sat at his desk before an open folder, waiting for a critical phone call. Meanwhile, 8,000 kilometers away in a desert chapel, Father Jean was on his knees.
Barefoot and breathless, a young boy had burst into the chapel 25 minutes earlier, gasping out a chilling 3-word warning. "They are coming." Father Jean did not need to ask for details. For 3 agonizing weeks, every settlement in the region had been bracing for this exact nightmare. Reports spoke of headlights, convoy trucks, and over 200 heavily armed men. Against this force, the village of 40 Christian families possessed only 3 rifles, some axes, and basic farm tools. There was no army to protect them, no escape route, and the nearest cell tower was 30 kilometers away. Their chapel, made of simple mud walls and a tin roof, was no fortress, but it was their only sanctuary. When the boy asked what to do, the priest replied with one word: pray. Then he tuned the radio.
Traversing 2 national borders, the desperate radio signal eventually reached a bishop in the capital city, who immediately contacted a cardinal in Rome. From there, the urgent message was passed directly to the Pope's personal secretary. Skipping all protocol, the secretary did not bother to knock, bursting into the papal study at precisely 11:43 p.m. Rome time. He uttered only 3 words: "Holy Father, now." Pope Leo was already on his feet. Before we uncover the incredible sequence of events that transpired over the next hour, an untold story of sheer administrative defiance, please take a moment to subscribe, hit that like button, and share your location in the comments. The Pope bypassed the Secretariat of State, ignored Cardinal Parolin, and left the press office completely in the dark. Bypassing even his closest advisors, the Pope dialed a highly classified number he was never officially supposed to possess. This was a secure direct line straight to a presidential palace in West Africa, known only to a selective handful of individuals worldwide. Pope Leo XIV had quietly ensured he was on that short list. 8 weeks prior, a visiting bishop had slipped the number to him in a sealed envelope during a private meeting, whispering that he hoped the pontiff would never have to use it. Leo had kept the envelope sealed for 3 weeks before finally memorizing the digits and burning the paper to ash. Now, at precisely 11:53 p.m. Rome time, the phone began to ring inside the African palace, where a clueless military aide picked up the line. No one had forewarned the palace aide about who was on the other end of the line. He assumed it was merely an internal staff member. But when a commanding voice demanded he get the president, the aide completely froze. He recognized the tone instantly, as did billions of people around the globe. After a tense pause, the aide stammered out a question, only to be met with an urgent command to connect them immediately. Exactly 43 seconds later, the nation's president was on the line. He was fully dressed in his office, anticipating political unrest, but certainly not a direct confrontation from the Vatican. Leo wasted no time, warning that 200 armed men were advancing on a specific village. When the president tried to argue, the Pope gave him exactly 60 minutes to act. Excuses poured from the president, who claimed that the roads were far too dangerous and that the militia operated entirely outside of state control. Pope Leo listened with absolute chilling silence, letting the politician exhaust his arguments before delivering a devastating ultimatum. He warned that 3 powerful nations were monitoring the village, and by morning, the world would judge his action or inaction. The Pope told him to choose his legacy, giving him precisely 1 hour before abruptly cutting the connection. Sitting back at his desk, Leo folded his hands, praying not for the villagers, but for the president's soul, which hung in the balance. Meanwhile, in the African palace, the line went dead, leaving the stunned leader clutching the silent receiver in sheer disbelief.
Observing from the doorway, the chief of staff watched the president struggle to process the gravity of the call he had just received. The leader quietly confirmed that the Pope had given them exactly 1 hour to intervene. Peering out the window at the flickering lights of the capital, the president knew that deep in the dark interior of his country, 200 armed militants were on the march. He had known about the convoy all along, having been advised to turn a blind eye and told that no religious authority would ever notice. But everything had changed. He spun around, ordering immediate contact with the army chief and the Eastern Command. Disregarding his advisor's hesitation about political exposure, he demanded swift action, sending the chief of staff rushing down the hall.
Returning to his desk, the president found his gaze drawn to the wooden cross hanging on his wall, a childhood gift from his grandmother. Though he was not a religious man, he suddenly felt the heavy weight of her judgment pressing down on him. Far away in the dark expanse of the desert, the armed militia remained completely oblivious to the shifting political tides. They laughed and cleaned their weapons, anticipating another routine raid without any threat of consequence. The lead driver casually lit a cigarette, his mind drifting to mundane thoughts of breakfast, entirely indifferent to the lives he was about to disrupt. But the calm was broken when the convoy's radio suddenly crackled to life, with an unfamiliar, authoritative voice, ordering them to stop immediately. Ignoring the initial command, the lead driver kept his foot on the accelerator for another tense minute. Then a second, far more commanding voice barked through the static, ordering an immediate halt. As the convoy slowed, furious arguments erupted over the radio between those wanting to push forward and those wanting to retreat. Suddenly, the debate was silenced by the appearance of 2 military helicopters hovering low on the horizon, their lights flashing like an impassable barrier. The militia stopped on the roadside, arguing for 15 minutes under the shadow of the circling aircraft. The driver suddenly realized that some unseen force from far away was watching them, completely unaware that this force was a praying pope in Rome. Enshrouded in darkness, the vulnerable village had already extinguished all of its lights to avoid detection. Father Jean had ushered the families inside the mud-walled chapel, where the terrified children and their mothers huddled in absolute silence. Outside, the men stood guard at the perimeter with a pathetic arsenal of 3 rifles, some axes, and bare hands. A villager named Daniel clutched an old single-shot rifle from a past war, counting his mere 4 bullets over and over. Inside the chapel, Father Jean lit a solitary candle on the dirt altar and assured the frightened families that they were not alone. When an 8-year-old girl stood up to ask if the Pope would save them, the priest fell silent, struggling to find the right words of hope. Forcing a gentle smile despite his trembling hands, Father Jean quietly reassured the little girl that the Holy Father already knew of their plight. As she sat back down, a mother drew her child closer. A baby whimpered, and an elderly woman began to hum a traditional hymn to soothe the room. Outside, the thick desert air hummed with insects, soon joined by the low, terrifying rumble of distant engines. Daniel was the first to spot the approaching headlights, tightening his grip on his ancient rifle without saying a word. Behind him, 2 young boys dragged a simple wooden bench from the chapel to serve as a symbolic barricade against the oncoming trucks. Stepping out into the dark, Father Jean stood beside Daniel, armed not with a weapon, but with a tightly clenched rosary. Whispering into the darkness, the priest asked how many vehicles were approaching, to which Daniel replied that he counted more than 20 pairs of headlights. This meant they were facing over 200 armed men. Father Jean closed his eyes, wondering if his desperate message had actually reached his bishop, the cardinals, or the Pope himself. Above them, the brilliant desert stars shone brightly, the very same stars that illuminated the Vatican,
the Presidential Palace, and the files in Rome. Inside the chapel, 8-year-old Esther clung tightly to her mother. She had been baptized 2 years prior in a neighboring village by a priest who had since mysteriously vanished. Now her fate, and the fate of her entire community, rested in the hands of a distant leader. Clinging to her mother, young Esther quietly counted the candles on the altar, noting that only one still flickered while the wind had extinguished the other 2. She whispered a poignant question, asking if the Pope knew her name too. Her mother, fighting back tears, assured her that he did, explaining that the Pope made sure to ask about each of them. Satisfied with this answer, the young girl closed her eyes and listened to the tense silence, punctuated only by the low rumble of idling engines in the distance. When Father Jean stepped back inside the chapel, he silently surveyed the gathered families, counting them one last time as he had done every night of this terrifying week, preparing for whatever fate the night would bring.
Our investigation begins with a silent ledger containing 40 families, exactly 152 vulnerable souls, 61 of whom were children. He had committed every single name to memory, never whispering a word of this act to another living person. This mental roster was a shield against a dark premonition. He feared that one day he would be forced to read these names at a mass funeral he would not even be allowed to conduct. Banishing the grim thought, he tightened his grip on his weathered rosary. Little did the isolated villagers know, they had been flagged on a secret watch list for weeks. Inside the Vatican, Pope Leo XIII kept this file locked in his private study. Only 2 people in the world held the brass key, the Pope and a trusted Augustinian sister. Sealed within that forbidden folder was a grim catalogue of names, remote villages, and faithful believers who faced execution simply for practicing their faith. This delicate operation began nearly a year prior, compiled in total secrecy without the knowledge of the Secretariat of State or the Council for Interreligious Dialogue. Even his most trusted cardinals remained completely in the dark. In his mind, this was not a list, but rather what he called the Watch. This was not about abstract theology, but geography and immediate physical danger. It tracked active threats, defenseless communities, silent priests, and scorched schools. Every single Friday night, before laying his head down to sleep, the Pope would open the file and speak their names aloud. To truly understand the weight of this file, you and I must examine how he handled those names. Occasionally, a new name was carefully written in, while other times a line was drawn through one. But do not misunderstand. A crossed-out name did not represent a life saved. He never spoke those crossed-out names again, choosing instead to refer to them by the date of their martyrdom, praying for them on that exact day every year. On this particular Friday, his vigil lasted over an hour as a heavy sense of dread kept him awake. It was not mere intuition, but the cold weight of experience. A bishop in West Africa had been sending urgent, quiet warnings over the last 2 weeks, reporting that hostile forces were gathering to strike an unknown village. The Pope had analyzed every word. Rather than waiting for the next warning dispatch, the pontiff took immediate, decisive action. For 3 full weeks, he had been quietly preparing his countermove behind closed doors. He reached out to 2 foreign ambassadors on their private lines, casually asking them to keep a close eye on the region. Next, he routed a discreet sum of Vatican funds to a local charity on the ground and sent a sealed, untraceable letter to a trusted contact in the capital. When Father Jean's desperate radio transmission arrived, 3 sovereign nations were already watching. This was no coincidence. It was a defense network built in absolute silence. While conservative cardinals would have condemned this as dangerous political interference, the Pope remained entirely indifferent. A profound sense of pastoral duty bound the pontiff to a tiny, unseen village. A priest he had never met, and an anonymous child whose face he would never see. To him, this quiet, active protection was the very essence of what a pope was meant to do.
But this unilateral operation could not remain hidden forever. At precisely 6:14 on Saturday morning, Cardinal Pietro Parolin discovered the truth in the most catastrophic way imaginable. An oblivious junior aide, unaware that the midnight call was strictly off the record, had attached a transcript fragment to the diplomatic brief. Parolin read it standing up, abandoned his coffee, and marched directly to the papal apartments, stopping at the threshold of the private chapel where the Pope was kneeling in prayer.
Standing silently at the threshold, the cardinal waited for the pontiff to finish making the sign of the cross before confronting him. He warned that the Secretariat of State could not be bypassed, pointing out that the Pope had phoned a head of state at midnight without a translator, a protocol officer, or an official transcript. The Pope calmly countered that a transcript did exist, and when Parolin demanded to know where it was, the pontiff simply tapped his temple. The 68-year-old cardinal, who had served 4 popes and managed global crises in 7 languages, was stunned by the response. He exhaled slowly, warning that while this rash move might have saved a single village, it risked starting a diplomatic conflict they could not contain. Insisting that he had only performed his duty, the Pope reminded Parolin that no other pontiff occupied the throne of St. Peter that night. Standing up, he swept past his stunned Secretary of State and walked directly to his desk to retrieve the folder, holding it high between them like an indictment. He demanded that Parolin read the contents and join him in protecting every single soul listed. The cardinal took the document, refusing to sit as he turned the pages with slow, deliberate movements. His initial anger gradually dissolved into a heavy, contemplative silence. By the time he reached the final page, his stern expression had completely softened, prompting him to ask how long this secret ledger had been kept. Answering curtly that the ledger had been kept long enough, the Pope confirmed that absolutely no one else had laid eyes on the document. When Parolin gasped that over 400 names and numerous vulnerable villages were detailed inside, the Pope simply nodded. Clutching the folder tightly to his chest, the cardinal stared at the floor, realizing his years of strategic preparation to oppose a reformist pontiff had not equipped him for this moral crisis. He quietly asked what was expected of him, and the Pope demanded that he stop obstructing progress, accusing him of running the Vatican like a mere embassy. Stepping closer, the Pope placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, urging him to use global diplomacy for its true, saving purpose. Declaring that the Church would no longer hide its persecuted believers behind hollow statements, the Pope dismissed the cardinal's concerns about the scale of the task. When Parolin whispered a plea for divine assistance, the Pope assured him that help was already with them. By late morning, the secret folder had evolved from a private dossier into a massive, highly coordinated Vatican operation. Far away, things escalated rapidly. A presidential aide was awakened at 1:11 a.m. An official order was signed by 1:30, and by 1:55, 2 military helicopters launched from a base 60 kilometers away. By 2:40, soldiers blocked the road outside the village, catching the 200 hostile men in the approaching trucks completely off guard. Assurances that the military would remain passive and the slaughter unnoticed proved entirely false. The hostile convoy was forced to grind to a halt just 2 kilometers from their target as a fierce radio dispute erupted between the opposing forces. The militant commander issued angry threats, but the army officer replied with chilling professional calm, warning them to turn around or face an international incident by morning. A heavy silence filled the airwaves before the rebel demanded to know who authorized this, only to be told it came directly from the president's office. Unable to believe their plot had been exposed, the militants finally ordered their trucks to retreat, vanishing into the darkness by 4 a.m. As the first rays of dawn broke, disciplined army patrols secured the outer perimeter of the village. By 7 a.m., the president's office issued a terse press release claiming they had successfully averted a minor incident in the Eastern Territory. To keep the public in the dark, the statement omitted the name of the village, any mention of the Christian minority, and the Pope's direct involvement.
This was a calculated cover story designed by the Pope himself, who wanted no sensational headlines, only the survival of the innocent. Inside the local chapel, the terrified villagers remained oblivious to the geopolitical maneuvering, hearing only the distant thud of helicopter rotors, followed by quiet.
Sprinting wild-eyed into the sanctuary, young Daniel disrupted the heavy silence with a mixture of hysterical tears and laughter. He shouted the unbelievable news that the attackers were turning back. Father Jean collapsed to his knees in wordless gratitude, while the children's weeping transformed from pure terror to overwhelming relief. Mothers broke into spontaneous hymns of praise, and the elderly grandmother resumed her traditional chant with bold, resonant strength. Remarkably, the single candle on the altar remained lit. As morning broke, the community began to move with extreme caution, like travelers testing fragile spring ice, as the heavy wooden doors were flung open and children stepped into the light. Exhausted after a sleepless, terrifying vigil, the survivors slowly filtered out into the morning dust. Some collapsed onto the dry ground, laughing in utter disbelief, while others stared in stunned silence at the empty road where their executioners had been expected to arrive. A 12-year-old boy approached Father Jean, holding up a small wooden cross he had snapped in half from clutching it so tightly in his pocket. He asked if God had saved them, and Father Jean smiled gently, replying that God had indeed intervened, but only because someone on earth had listened. Nearby, 8-year-old Esther stood at the road's edge, silently pocketing a smooth stone she had picked up. Tears of relief flowed freely as women walked through the newly restored safety of the morning. One mother embraced her young son with such desperate strength that the boy laughed, playfully pushing her away before wrapping his arms tightly around her neck. Throughout the village, front doors swung open, and the comforting aroma of wood smoke rose from cooking fires. The elderly grandmother, her hands still trembling with leftover adrenaline, began baking bread exactly as she had for 60 years, creating the finest loaf of her life. Father Jean walked the streets slowly, stopping at every household to verify that everyone was safe, repeating a single, powerful refrain. "We are still here." While the refrain of survival echoed through the saved village, you and I must turn our gaze back to the quiet halls of Rome, where a sleepless pope was already preparing his next tactical move. On this tense Saturday morning inside the Vatican, Pope Leo XIII went straight from the chapel to his desk, completely ignoring his physical exhaustion. He had to draft the upcoming Sunday Regina Caeli address. Normally, this is a routine Marian prayer and reflection, but this particular Sunday was destined to shock the world. Sitting at his wooden desk, he wrote and immediately crossed out paragraph after paragraph. His worried secretary begged him to rest, but the Pope resolutely replied that he would only find peace after he had delivered his sermon. We begin our investigation in the quiet chambers of the Vatican, where a secretary delivered coffee to the Holy Father. The Pope ignored the steaming cup, writing without pause until 11 in the morning. He produced 3 pages, read them twice, and then systematically tore 2 of them to shreds. He kept only 1. On that single sheet, only 1 paragraph truly mattered, and inside that paragraph, a single sentence was paramount. He had been crafting this line in his mind for weeks. He hid the paper from everyone, even Cardinal Parolin, slipping it into his inner cassock pocket. After a brief evening mass and barely 4 hours of sleep, he woke at 5 to pray and wait for noon. On the morning of Sunday, May 3rd, St. Peter's Square overflowed with tens of thousands of pilgrims. Children sat high on their fathers' shoulders, a Brazilian choir sang, and delegations from Poland stood watch while cameras focused on the high window. At noon, the shutters opened and Pope Leo XIV stepped out. Though visibly exhausted, he smiled and began leading the Regina Caeli prayer, greeting visitors and blessing the sick. It seemed like an ordinary Sunday. Then, he paused. He looked down at his hidden paper, looked up at the crowd, and then stared past them straight into the camera lenses. He declared that 40 Christian families had woken up in their homes that morning in an unnamed land. Those families were never supposed to survive the night. The Pope declared that the Holy See views their lives as sacred, promising to defend them by every means available to a church that no longer waits. Below him, the vast crowd began to applaud, though the vast majority did not grasp the gravity of what they had just heard. It sounded powerful, so they cheered, yet a subtle unease rippled through the square. Translators faltered over those final words, and seasoned journalists in the press gallery traded sharp, questioning looks. While some scrambled to scribble notes, one veteran Vatican correspondent did not write a single word. He simply laid his pen down, fully aware of the storm that had just been unleashed. If you and I look closely at this moment, we see the trap snapping shut. The veteran reporter had processed every syllable and understood the deep implications immediately. Leaning over, he whispered to his colleague that the Pope had just made a massive commitment. When asked what he meant, he explained that the pontiff had publicly bound the Vatican to defending persecuted Christians by every means available. He emphasized that using terms like every and no longer waits was not mere rhetoric. It was a direct shift in policy. As his colleagues stared in disbelief, the veteran muttered that the rules had just changed in a single sentence. For weeks, the Secretariat of State had fought hard against altering their diplomatic playbook. Historically, the Vatican favored a strategy of quiet diplomacy, soft statements of concern, and symbolic visits rather than direct intervention or warning networks. But Pope Leo XIV demanded real action. When bureaucrats warned him that the world was highly sensitive and the Church must tread carefully, his response was sharp. The Church must be careful to protect its own people. He had ordered the Secretariat to write a bold public stance, but they chose to drag their feet instead. They formed a working group that met 3 times and produced absolutely nothing. Seeing the endless stalling, the Holy Father simply decided that he would no longer wait for his own administration. By uttering those 28 words during the live broadcast, the Pope created an unalterable reality. Once a pontiff makes such a public declaration in St. Peter's Square, with cameras capturing every second, the vast Vatican bureaucracy cannot walk it back. The institution is forced to comply, to draft policies that align with his words, to secure funding, and to staff the mission. Pope Leo XIV had successfully bypassed a whole year of stagnant committee meetings in a single moment. Inside his private apartments, Cardinal Parolin listened to the broadcast with the official, approved transcript in his hands. He stared at the paper, knowing full well that those words were never written there. Our investigation shows that the Pope had deliberately inserted the unsanctioned line himself. Watching the broadcast, Cardinal Parolin folded his copy of the speech with slow, deliberate movements. Rather than showing anger, his face wore an expression of quiet relief. He remarked softly that the Holy Father had actually done it. When an assistant asked what had been done, Parolin replied that the Pope had just bound the entire Church to the list. While the young Monsignor did not comprehend the gravity of those words, he soon would. By Sunday afternoon, the press remained oblivious, framing the address as a moving homily, though a few asked about the mysterious village. Let us look at how the geopolitical dominoes began to fall that very evening. A prominent European foreign minister contacted the Vatican directly, demanding to know what the phrase "every means available" truly signified. The deputy secretary took the call personally, offering a blunt response. It meant exactly what it sounded like. In Asia, a bishop sent a coded message to the Pope containing 11 names of imprisoned priests, adding a handwritten note that echoed the Pope's words. Within 12 hours, an American charity established an emergency crisis fund. Meanwhile, a reporter searched fruitlessly for the unnamed village, unaware that the Pope had hidden its location perfectly. Early Monday morning, a silent shift occurred thousands of kilometers away that no observer connected to the Pope's speech. A Catholic nun named Sister Mary Teresa stepped out of a cold prison cell after 11 grueling months of captivity. Unbeknownst to her captors, her name sat on page 17 of the Pope's private folder, underlined twice. At 63 years old, she had been taken by force from her school by armed militants. For nearly a year, the regime denied her existence, while diplomats filed polite, useless inquiries. Suddenly, on that quiet Monday, Her heavy cell door swung open. A guard handed over her coat and muttered a cold warning to walk forward and never look back. Stepping out into the blinding morning sun, she found a dark sedan waiting near the prison gate. Inside sat a quiet bishop she had never seen before. He offered no elaborate explanations, whispering only that the Holy Father was aware of her situation. She wept quietly throughout the long drive to the runway. When her flight landed in Rome 48 hours later, Pope Leo XIV was waiting on the tarmac without a single reporter in sight. He was accompanied only by a trusted cardinal, his secretary, and the keeper of the second key. Before she could kneel, the Pope kissed her hand, telling her that her name was on a list that would never be allowed to fail. As night fell on Sunday, Pope Leo XIV gathered a small, highly classified group inside the Apostolic Palace. Cardinal Parolin, 3 key church leaders, and 2 intelligence officers from the Secretariat sat waiting alongside the sister who guarded the second key. The Pope laid the heavy leather folder on the wooden table and took his seat. He looked directly at each official and delivered a cold, clear mandate. This was the list, and they would protect every single person on it. No one dared to raise an objection. Parolin slowly slid the document closer, flipped open the 3rd page, and pointed to a specific village in the eastern Sahel slated for action the following day. Now, you and I must realize how personal this mission was to the Pope. He nodded and instructed the sister to ensure that Father Jean was informed of the plan. For another hour, the cardinals analyzed every page, dividing targets by geographical sectors and assigning direct responsibility to specific agents. Once every endangered name was accounted for, the Pope bypassed sleep entirely, returning to his private study to place a highly encrypted call. It took over 30 minutes to connect through static-filled lines. When the call finally connected, the Pope simply said, "Father Jean, this is Leo," leaving the priest on the other end in absolute silence. Stunned by the voice on the other end of the line, Father Jean could barely speak. The Pope quickly cut through the emotion, stating that his time was short, but his message was vital. They were no longer alone in their struggle. From that very evening, they had been officially added to a protected list that would not be permitted to fail under any circumstances. When the speechless priest struggled to find words, Leo told him to say nothing and simply assure the children that their Pope knew who they were. After a brief promise of mutual prayer and future meetings, the line went dead. Father Jean stood motionless in the dark, clutching the silent receiver. Outside the remote chapel, the altar candle burned down to a tiny wax puddle as the priest stepped into the cool night air. The sky above the village was clear and packed with stars, while the dusty road, which had been choked with hostile military trucks just hours earlier, was completely deserted. Father Jean whispered in awe that the Pope knew, his voice rising in disbelief. Meanwhile, in Rome, Pope Leo XIV closed the red folder and stared out into the quiet square. The crowds had vanished, completely unaware of the shift that had occurred. But the key players, the Secretariat, the bishops, and foreign intelligence networks, understood perfectly. As we conclude this investigation, it becomes clear that power does not always speak in thunderous proclamations. The Pope had reshaped global diplomacy using just 28 words spoken from a window he had never desired to occupy. He bypassed councils and avoided political warfare, simply to ensure 40 families would survive the night. The following morning, the Vatican press office issued a brief release thanking global partners, deliberately repeating the phrase, "every means available," 3 separate times. While careless reporters overlooked the nuance, intelligence agencies immediately began demanding answers about what had changed. But the real answer was a who, and 2 more villages were secured. By the dawn of the next weekend, 3 priests who had been languishing in overseas detention were quietly, almost invisibly, set free. No official paper trail linked their release to the Vatican, and none was needed. The pontiff remained silent on the plight of persecuted Christians for days afterward, having already delivered the only sentence that truly mattered. As he turned the page of his dossier, the burden of this watch shifted to the entire church. Meanwhile, on the edge of a vast red desert,
Father Jean silently lit a single candle beneath a wooden cross. You and I have just witnessed what the world almost missed. If you found this compelling, subscribe, hit like, and tell us, can a single sentence from the Pope truly reshape global events? Stay close.